Okay, so welcome everyone. Thanks for attending this evening's AIAA webinar. This is obviously, we have our esteemed speaker, Dr. Douglas, who will be presenting on the MIT Museum. And I'm sure everyone read the intro, but just to reiterate Dr. Douglas's fascinating background. So she is currently the Director of Collections and Curator of Science and Technology at the MIT Museum. She is an Associate Fellow of AIAA and a specialist in the history of technology and science. Prior to her time at MIT, she held positions at various esteemed institutions, including the Smithsonian's National Air and Space Museum, NASA Langley Research Center, and the Chemical Heritage Foundation, which is now called the Science History Institute. And this talk will cover an insider's look into the new MIT Museum, which is very exciting, and opening in spring 2022. And specifically, Dr. Douglas will be going over the exceptional aerospace collections that we should be able to see in the near future post-pandemic. And yeah, given the crucial role of museums in preserving scientific history and the strong anecdotal aspects of the aerospace field, I very much look forward to this talk, as do, I'm sure, the rest of the audience. So with that, I will let you take it away.
Well, thank you very much. And putting together this talk was a really fun exercise. I think I got a little farther into the history of the museum then so you're gonna benefit from my some of my investigations. This year actually marks the 50th anniversary of the MIT Museum, so I'm going to give you a little background to that story, a little bit of how MIT got in the museum business, and there's a lot of ties with the MIT and aeronautics and space story. And so you'll see, I'm going to make some references to that, and hopefully you'll enjoy some of the really cool pictures that we have gathered from really more than over a century of aviation involvement. But I know that there are students and members of AIAA who are alumni of many institutions. So I don't want to short shrift the incredible accomplishments of New England aerospace. We don't think of New England as a really heavy-duty aerospace community. You know, people think of Southern California or Texas or Kennedy Space Center in Virginia, and then scratch their heads when it comes to New England. But in fact, we have some of the preeminent participants in the aerospace industry and contributors that all through the history of aviation and space have left their mark in this community. So the picture that you see on the left here is of the new building. The museum is moving about a half-mile away from its current location on the northern side of MIT's campus, right into the heart of Kendall Square. And this picture was taken last fall when certainly, as you can see, the exterior shell of the building was finished. And I should add here, I don't know if you'll be able to see my cursor move around, but the museum occupies the first 3 floors of this building, and then everything above that is a commercial office tower that will be home to Boeing's Aurora Flight Sciences, Apple, Capital One, and a handful of other small development firms. There's about 352,000 square feet of space in this building. Each floor is about 50,000 square feet of space. So let's dive in. This is a picture, though, of Kendall Square back in 2013-14 here. And those of you that have not been to this part of Cambridge recently will find the changes quite surprising and shocking. In a few months, as a matter of fact, the big tower that you see here on the left is going to be demolished and come down. There are now giant towers that hover over all of these buildings in here. And where there is a parking lot, that's where our building is located. So just to orient yourself in sort of a half dozen years, there's an enormous change taking place in this area. But MIT's interest in museums actually goes back to its founding. The William Barton Rogers had a view that in order to teach science and technology properly, you not only needed to have a new kind of educational institution, one that elevated the laboratory to an equal status with the lecture hall, but that it also needed to feature communities of people that came together on a regular basis to learn about science and technology and cutting edge developments. But also, as you can see in this phrase, that museums had a role, that the display of material culture was equally important to that endeavor. So this goes right back to the founding of the Institute. This was our first building on the left, and you can see one of the chemistry lecture halls on the right. But Rogers went into some specificity about museums, and you can see in these quotes here that he wasn't interested in hoarding a bunch of old stuff or interesting stuff. As he put it, a mere miscellaneous collection of objects, however vast, has little power to instruct or even incite inquiry. So he really saw the museum as a tool for teaching and learning and engagement. That's a very modern idea. That's a very distinctive idea. In the mid-19th century, museums really meant cabinets of curiosity or great state accumulations of great state treasures, particularly in the form of art or sculpture. Again, we were chartered on April 10th in 1861, and right in the actual state charter was this statement that MIT was to be a three-part entity, that it was to form a society of the arts, a museum of the arts, and a school of industrial science. And they did not use the word art to mean the visual arts as we might think of them today. That was really the way in which they referred to technology. The word technology in the name was brand new. Hard to believe that today, but we have only been using that word for a little over 150, 60 years. And so for many people, the name of this new educational institution was actually quite baffling. What did it actually do? And so that's where these phrases come from here. But I mention this to say that the idea of a museum has been important at the Institute for a long time. However, on April 12th, 1861, some of you listening may remember that that was when the shots were fired on Fort Sumter and the United States dissolved into the Civil War. And that made the fundraising exercise for this new institution incredibly challenging. There were people who were quite optimistic in spite of the Civil War, that eventually the war would conclude and that institutions such as one envisioned by William Barton Rogers and his associates represented an optimistic statement for the future. But it meant they managed to build the School for the Industrial Arts, and they managed to convene that Society of the Arts, which became a kind of weekly enterprise for revealing new discoveries in science. But the museum part was set aside, with the exception of the fact that many departments, as you can see in this photograph, began to accumulate examples of works. This is the civil engineering department called this their museum, and you can see all sorts of examples if you look closely in the photograph of truss bridge structures and other apparatus that were used by the students as part of their instruction. Today, most of the people probably listening in this call have had training as an engineer, and you can think fondly or less fondly about PSETs and calculus and mathematical analysis and statistics and all of the computational investigations that are central to the discipline. But in this mid-19th century period, that world is yet to come. And so there was a notion that to be an engineer, you did need a common vocabulary in mathematics, but that meant algebra. In certain sciences, principally chemistry and physics, and that those disciplines would help inform your analysis. But at the same time, being an engineer meant close examination of built structures. And so these models were extremely important in helping one learn how previous engineers solved key design problems and where change might be possible in the future. MIT was the first school to teach architecture, offer architecture instruction in the United States. And they too accumulated and had a space they referred to as their museum. This stereo card shows plaster replicas of sculptures and decorative arts features from all over Europe. William Ware went to Europe during the course of the Civil War, purchased these items to bring back for students to have for their drawing classes and for the study of form that was so crucial to the early stages of architecture instruction. I mentioned the Society of the Arts, and at MIT, that meant that every week, at least once a week, if not twice, people gathered to hear scientists, engineers, inventors, entrepreneurs come and present their work for the first time. It was, today people might tune into a Nova special or a Discovery Channel piece. But this was the place to be. MIT was the place to be if you wanted to keep up with what was coming online. And I show this picture is of Edward Muybridge's horse in motion studies. These are studies that would later inspire our own Harold Edgerton with his stroboscopic photography. But MIT was the place where you could see Muybridge's work and meet him for the first time. In the 19th century, though, MIT was a fragile enterprise, not the robust, vigorous, well endowed and well federally funded and supported institution that it is today. But by the late 19th, early 20th century, a dilemma emerged. The city of Boston had exploded in its population. So you might remember from that very first picture how isolated that first building looked like. That was in the Back Bay of Boston. But all the spaces had filled in that half century. Boston's population tripled as a wonderful consequence of the immigration that took place in the late 19th century. But that cramped the Institute's style. There was no room to grow. And dependent as it was on tuition, it needed to have more students in order to operate. But also science and technology had changed. And a good example is in the aerospace field. There were in the 1890s lots of reports about experiments with heavier than air flight going on. And some students got very keen on that. They formed in the 1890s an aeronautics club, and they brought began to do some student thesis experiments. In fact, they even created a wind tunnel out of one of the ventilation ducts in the building, engineering building, and conducted simple experiments there that form, you can still look up and find these bachelor's degree theses in even some of them are even online. But they reached a dilemma of what they couldn't grow and expand. And then our neighbors down the street, Harvard, received a very astonishingly large bequest from the estate of Harold McKay. And the McKay funds, gift might not sound very big today, of $4.5 million. Equaled the value of MIT's entire physical plant. And that gift was to create a school of engineering at MIT. And so many at the Institute on the corporation worried that that was going to basically that Harvard would build a brand new physical plant for engineering in Alston, and that they would steal away all of the MIT faculty. And the Institute would essentially be left to wither without funds, without an adequate physical plant. So there was a proposal to merge in the 1904-5-6 timeframe. Ultimately, that failed, not because of, and the corporation and the presidents of Harvard and MIT wanted it to go through. The alumni of both institutions and the faculty of both institutions did not, decidedly not wish that to take place. But it was ultimately Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court that ruled against it, saying that the McKay will had been very clear that of all the things Harvard could do with that money, merge with MIT was not one of them. It was quite explicit. So with that kiboshed, the question was what next? And they floundered around for a few years until in 1909, they hired William McLaurin, who had, he was a young man in his mid 40s at the time. And he had a broad vision, and he decided he would move the Institute 4 blocks north. Granted, there's the Charles River in between, from its previous location in the Back Bay into its present site in Cambridge. The very first structure, however, that was erected on that site was a small wooden shed that featured this structure. This is MIT's first wind tunnel. And in 1913, MIT inaugurated an aeronautical engineering program. It and the University of Michigan became the first two institutions to teach at, in the case of Michigan, at the undergraduate level, and in the case of MIT at the graduate level, the first institutions to teach aeronautical engineering. And this wind tunnel was built from plans brought back to MIT by Jerome Hunsaker, who from the National Physical Laboratory. It's an atmospheric wind tunnel. The test section is roughly in the middle there. The fan and blower is at the far end of this picture. And that this tunnel was built by William McCracken and Donald Douglas, who were both early, graduate students here in the program at MIT. And one cannot overstate the influence of this tunnel, because those plans, not McCracken, excuse me, went on to become wind tunnel number 1 at NASA Langley. It became a wind tunnel. The plans were rebuilt again at the Naval's Aeronautical Engineering Research Laboratory in Washington, D.C. The same plans were then used to build a similar tunnel at Curtiss-Wright. So it really shows the early influence. This is arguably one of the most important examples of technology transfer from England to the United States, and then disseminated from MIT into both industry and the military and government research laboratories. And then finally, in 1916, when we dedicated this new complex that went up, for a few minutes was the world's largest reinforced concrete structure in the world, you might say, hey, that looks like the Wright Flyer here, and you'd be right. It is, in fact, the original 1903 Wright Flyer, and the dedication of MIT was the first public display ever of the Wright Flyer after the accident at Kitty Hawk, December 17th, 1903. When that first round of flights concluded in December, there were some minor repairs that needed to be made. They went in for lunch. A gust came and blew the Flyer up and caused severe damage. And it was cold and windy. They had snapped a picture. They felt confident that they had achieved the results that they wanted to in this round of testing. Telegraphed, Orville and Wilbur telegraphed their father and said, home by Christmas. They packed up the Wright Flyer into crates that were drawn initially by horses, and then, packed onto trains and returned to Dayton, Ohio. They stayed in those crates. There had been a big flood in Dayton, and when they opened up the crates, to prepare for a display here at MIT, they discovered that all of the fabric had really been severely damaged by that flood and had rotted. And so they recovered it. That's why the airplane looks so pristine in this image. And they chopped up all of the surviving remnants of fabric, and those became these famous souvenirs, generally 1-inch squares, although there's some 2 by 2-inch squares around, that you will see in various museum collections or treasured by aviation enthusiasts that were distributed by Lester Gardner on behalf of the Wright brothers. Lester Gardner was the founder of AIAA. He was also an MIT alumnus. And so he took care to manage the distribution of these early aviation relics, but they come from this incident. And I mention this again because this idea of open houses and public displays are definitely something that this new building inspired in the Institute. Elsewhere on the campus in the open house, there were displays by student groups and laboratories. This was the MIT Wireless Society, and they were showing off their radios and equipment. We'd call them ham radio fans today. I love the sign though in the middle here, which says, yes, you could communicate anywhere in the United States, of course. And then it says Europe, ? Cinch. But I was struck by here now just, a little over a century ago that they were proposing communications with Mars. And so thinking about the flights last week on Mars and, the work of the last 20 years or so, 25 years in terms of our return to the red planet. I'm struck by these students' ambition more than a century ago. That event, this dedication involved the largest single transcontinental telephone circuit ever created. The first transcontinental telephone call had only been made a year earlier in 1915. And for the dedication, there's a bunch of people here gathered in Symphony Hall for this big event. But then they organized groups of alumni all over the country in these locations that you see here, built this circuit and gave every participant their own receiver so that they could listen into the speeches, which included one Orville Wright bringing, but also Thomas Edison and Alexander Graham Bell. And so it was kind of a who's who of American invention. But I'm thinking of our Zoom meetings in the last year and how this foreshadowed this idea of, group communications with each other. The first purpose-built museum at MIT came in 1922, and this gallery exists to this day. It's called the Hart Nautical Gallery, and it was an idea, one of these departmental museums ideas that the faculty in the Department of Naval Architecture and Marine Engineering believed was essential for instruction. And they put into place, when they got the funds to build their new building, they included a specific gallery for the display of ship models, half-hull models, and these cabinets that you see some of the models sitting on all had pigeonholes underneath, and they were where plans and original diagrams could be shown. Naval architecture was one of the early homes of MIT's aeronautical engineering program before it became a full-fledged department unto itself. In 1939, MIT took on another museum, the Dard Hunter Paper Museum. This was a long-term deposit. It was at MIT from 1939 until 1953, and it represented the ambition to develop displays that were both instructive and inspirational to the students and to some extent the larger community. This picture here harkens back to William Barton Rogers' vision. And Rogers had this notion that museums were for instruction. And if you read the caption closely, it says that, here are students building this plaster of Paris map of the Pacific. And it was led by Arthur Watson, the chairman of the Committee on the Technology Museum. So those plans continued. The libraries thought that they might be the home of a new museum, and they submitted this plan in 1945. It wasn't adopted at this time, but under this purposes of the museum, you will see an expanded notion of not just instruction, although that's there, enrichment of the daily life of the Institute family, enlightenment of the adult visiting public, enlightenment of an adult public unable to visit MIT, and entertainment and stimulation of local school public, all through exhibitions and kindred museum activities. That mission is not that far off of what we are today. The biggest open house since 1916, however, took place in November 1945. This was called the Victory in Science Open House. It followed World War II. And we know that there were some 75,000 visitors because you had to buy a 10-cent war stamp in order to gain access to the displays that were inside the building. Anyone could go into the courtyard here and see these external displays, but if you were going to come inside and see all the cool radar technology that the Rad Lab had worked on, you were going to have to buy a war bond. MIT was very involved in aviation. Again, wasn't building the bombers, but the Rad Lab, they called it radiation to throw the Germans off of the scent, but was the principal site for the development of radar in the United States. They thought when the British gave us a cavity magnetron to copy and help with its manufacturing in 1941, they thought that task would take a year and about 50 people. 4+ years later, there were 4,000 employees. The MIT Radar School had trained 9,000 military pilots and navigators. They had developed 150 different radar systems, including, in addition, they also developed the Loran technology. But that wasn't the only thing they were doing. The instrumentation laboratory under a young, energetic Charles Start Draper was developing gun sight technology that became crucial to the war in the Pacific. The new Wright brothers wind tunnel that you see the propeller blades in the center lower picture there was running 3 shifts a day doing largely drag cleanup studies for industry throughout the duration of the war. There were also military schools that took place here. So there's this ongoing connection with industry and with government. The open houses really then continued annually. This is one from 1948, and you can see this is in the air, particularly features engines out of the aeronautics department collection. General Electric was nearby, and they provided many examples that students could take apart, inspect, and conduct experiments with. But the general public, as you can see here, was very happy to have the opportunity to see such technologies up close. In in 1949, the Institute sponsored a massive public event called the Mid-Century Convocation. It filled the old Boston Garden, partly because the keynote speaker was Winston Churchill, who urged the audience to not merely be enthusiastic about the contributions that could be made by science and technology, but to integrate those effectively with the humanities and the arts. In this time period of the 40s and 50s, in the Cold War, MIT became very involved in the pioneering work in computers. On the right is a core memory unit from the Whirlwind computer. What they don't remember is that the Whirlwind project started as a flight simulator that was to have an analog computer. At the war, that started in 43, 344, and very quickly that transitioned to becoming a digital computer project, which was the #1 project of the Office of Naval Research, and then was taken over by the Air Force to form this sort of continental network of radar installations and computer installations that formed what's called the SAGE system, or semi-automatic ground environment. Those systems, or that computer, that SAGE system, put IBM in the computer business. They're one of the tenants in our new building above us. But more importantly for this audience to know that the commercial version of SAGE was a system called Sabre, which became American Airlines, the basis of American Airlines' first airline reservation system. So let me see if I can find my cursor again. Here we go. The Cold War, of course, heats up with the launch of Sputnik in 1958. That technology that Draper, the instrumentation lab, was very integral in the development of ICBM, the guidance, navigation, and control technologies for the ICBMs, led to the iLab and MIT being awarded the first NASA Apollo contract to develop the guidance, navigation, and control systems for the Apollo space program. You can see that here, but at the very same time, there is uneasiness with these developments. So this is July of '69, and this is November of '69. And the students and others are protesting outside of the iLab. And so you can see the absolute pinnacle, a zenith of Draper's and the iLab's achievements. And then shortly thereafter, it was announced that they would be divested from MIT. I bring you to this point, though, is this is precisely the moment that the MIT Museum is founded, in this confluence of what is the place of technology in society? What is those roles of art and humanities and philosophy? How do they help us make better judgments as a society, to be better as a democracy? And this is the moment that Jerome Wiesner, who had been President Kennedy's science advisor and had been so crucial in the space program's formative phases, is elected and inaugurated as president. And as part of that ceremony, Wiesner asked that the actual ceremony be quite spare and limited, that it not be full of the kind of pomp and circumstance that is more typical of a college inauguration, but that it would be preceded by a series of events that would raise the most compelling and perhaps controversial issues of the day, that it would offer a chance to reflect on past achievements as well as present challenges. And so it's in this mix that they decided they wanted a small exhibit that reflected on MIT's early history. And that 10-day display called Retrospect is the birth of our museum. And it started with a simple quest. An administrator in the School of Humanities, Warren Siemens, was asked to find photographs, and could he track down this portrait of William Barton Rogers and a bust of him, and nobody knew where they were at. They had some success actually finding it in the building that you see in the center of the screen here. This is our current location at MIT. It's referred to as N52 and N51. We occupy the second floor and now a piece of the ground floor of this. But on the second floor, there was some storage of old paintings and institute furnishings. And when Warren found those materials, he was able to develop an exhibition that people really enjoyed. And it prompted the chairman of the corporation and outgoing president to suggest that perhaps the Institute ought to have some kind of museum. And that led to the creation of what was called the Historical Collections, with its first task to take care of these portraits and paintings that had all been stuffed away and forgotten in these back rooms, but also to create a comprehensive photography collection. As you can see here, they thought, they might be able to come up with as many as 250,000 images. I can tell you, as I'm leading a project right now to digitize those images. It's probably, the collection that he built is closer to 130,000, but it's still a very impressive endeavor that took place in the first couple of years. This is just to give you a picture. You can see lots of, you can see why these paintings had gotten kind of stuffed away in the 70s. Today there would be all sorts of critiques perhaps offered up as to the race and gender of many of the subjects of these paintings. But actually that's not a new critique. That was a critique offered in the time period. And so many of the senior administration, the deans and provosts and the like, had removed these portraits and paintings from their offices, and they were in storage. So Warren found a way to kind of take care of them and see and make them accessible to a public audience. You can see in 1979, the Institute decided that this 8-year-old experiment should be permanent. This is the correspondence that led, and a year later, they expanded the name to be the MIT Museum and Historical Collections. Warren would retire 6 years later in 1996, and that at 1996, excuse me. And that was a pivotal year in our museum's history. It was the end of the first era of collecting, of accumulating stuff. And the grandest acquisition in that time period was the New York Museum of Holography, which came in 1993, and the inaugural exhibition in 96 catapulted our minuscule attendance from about 8,000 visitors annually to 20,000 visitors. And that meant that when Warren retired, they decided that the next stage for the museum ought to be to professionalize it at all levels, management and curatorial staff. And in fact, I was hired as the first curator of science and technology in 1999. I will say that visitation has grown from 20,000 until, well, just before the pandemic, 170,000 visitors annually. But what it really launched is an incredible 2 decades of growth and expansion, everything from new exhibits that for the first time employed professional exhibit designers. We continue to explore themes of art and technology. So our kinetic sculpture, Arthur Ganson exhibition continues to be popular. But the rocket really left the launch pad with the hiring of John Durant in 2005. John brought with him ideas programmatically. The Cambridge Science Festival, which is going on now this year virtually, is now its 15th or 16th year, 15th year, excuse me. But that launched a 10-day festival, the first of its kind in North America. Some of you may have participated in, the big events like the Science Carnival, or perhaps some of the smaller events sponsored, but it attracts on average about 60, 70,000 visitors to the greater metropolitan Boston region. We expanded to the ground floor with new exhibits and had a storefront presence. That had the immediate effect of doubling our attendance. We took collections that were shoehorned into the tiny backroom spaces here and leased a warehouse in Somerville that enabled us to grow and expand our curatorial options. We have a collection of about 1.5 million objects, including really the preeminent university aerospace collection in the world. We were encouraged to take on interesting experiments. This was a reenactment of Edgerton's Bullet Through the Apple with Edgerton's gun and cameras and recorders that took place in 2013. We continued with certain popular family events, the Friday after Thanksgiving event. Some of you may have attended this event 2 summers ago in the 50th anniversary of the Apollo moon landing, where we hosted the team that restored a Apollo guidance computer to working order and used that and demonstrated through the use of the simulator and other techniques, but using the original, or one of the original Apollo guidance computers landing on the moon. So that those expansion events in conjunction with our service to the Institute, this was the 150th exhibition in 2015, meant that the Institute was receptive to an idea of something new that we might do with the museum. And so 11 years ago, MIT first announced it wanted to develop Kendall Square. The city was not enthusiastic until, as a significant cultural amenity, the museum was added into that mix. And that was a consequence of Mijin Yoon, who was then in the department chair of the Department of Architecture, but she and her husband's firm had been doing a space analysis of our present museum, and she was serving on the committee with the city and suggested that the museum might be, it really would benefit from new space, and that challenge or that idea led to this proposal that we moved to this new facility. So that's where it started. This was the building structures. These were the architect's rendering of what each of those buildings might look like. This was the architect's idea of our, sketch of our building. Haller and Yoon, though, had the challenge of figuring out the inside, and what they thought was perhaps our plan ought to be an extension of the famous infinite corridor, and to create a spiral of exhibits that the public would wrap themselves around, and that would embrace the public and collection and administrative spaces, rather than putting all the galleries on one floor and all the classrooms and so forth on the second floor. We were engaged very heavily in developing master plans for this concept. Once the architects have created a building plan, what are you going to put in it? How are you going to finish it off? We broke ground in 2018. Although technically, as you can see here, that picture was taken that same day. We had obviously construction had started prior to the groundbreaking ceremony, because you can see that central core elevator shaft beginning to go up and the foundation had been poured. This is some plans of the interior of the building. And I will show you some additional plans in a section, but you can see this. These were the architect's renderings of, what the space would look like. You literally will come off the T-stop and the door will be right there in there. So our entrance, there's a large lobby, there's a big grand staircase. This is a museum shop. This will be, this ground portion is free. And we hope will be the site of both informal and formal gatherings going forward in the future. There's another rendering of this, the architects doing drawings of what that grand staircase will look like, taking you up to the exhibit space. This is an internal program space. We call it the Exchange. That will be a site for programs, maybe like this one, for example, in the future. We had an idea for, this is our idea hub. Now, architects can only take you so far, because no maker space will ever look this neat or tidy. The pandemic also created some challenges. So you can see, me and my homemade project of how do you develop the furnishings. This is some of the external shots of construction going on. These were taken this summer and early September, as they were just finishing this. I like this picture because my office is right here, where you can see it on the back of house. And you can get a sense of just peeking in the windows, some of the construction in the space going on. These are all shots I was able to take through the windows. This is some back of house into the back of the lobby, back part of the lobby there. This will be the front entrance. And these drawings that you see here give you a sense of exhibitions, a big opening exhibition called Essential MIT, a biotech life science exhibit, our exchange space up the stairs to an immersive art science gallery, exhibit on AI that will feature some of the work of Aurora, and then our larger collections gallery that you see here. And again, these are early on. These were from our concept and schematic design phases of some of the thoughts of what some of these spaces might look like inside, including in our collections gallery in here. So you're able to see a little bit of what's going on that front. I'm aware here of the time, so I'm not going to go into, I was going to do one last detail to kind of talk about what makes this space distinctive, and I'll tell you the story of an emulator that we've built that allows you to experience the Whirlwind computer. But I think it might be appropriate to just pause at this moment and to invite any questions or comments that might that people listening in might have at this time.
Any questions from the audience? Feel free to send me a message. I can unmute you. If not, I have a couple of questions off the top of my head. So Dr. Douglas, thank you again for sharing your insight and also helping us kind of bridge the past with the present. I really loved hearing about the Wireless Society back in the, you know, I don't remember, it was late 19th century.
1916.
Oh,
So
1916, wow. Okay, so
yeah, so
early 20th century.
105 years ago.
Yeah, and as an amateur radio operator myself, that was really neat to see. And the first jerry-rigged, albeit brilliant, wind tunnel
Yeah.
at MIT. That was a cool story to hear. So I'd be interested to know, how have the mission and objectives of the new MIT Museum changed, since 2018, or have they changed at all?
Yes, I think a couple of important changes are there, which is we've, for years, our director, John, has paraphrased our mission statement by saying, I think it's simple. Our goal is to make research, innovation accessible to everyone. And that's a platitude that, say, 15 years ago, people took that in the frame of the public engagement of science and technology and saying, we need to do better outreach and help educate the public. And many of younger members probably benefited from those efforts, as student, think of FIRST robotics competitions or other special programs in schools and outreach efforts by companies and other engineers trying to encourage you to pursue STEM careers. Then that phrase got modified from the public understanding of science to public engagement with science, saying, well, it's not just expert scientists and engineers talking at, people who don't know anything, that citizens, just because they're not an engineer or they're not a scientist, doesn't mean that they don't have important perspectives on subjects, and that that the role of museums should be to help cultivate conversation, dialogue, discourse, not just educating you on something, but really creating a space that invites people in. And so when we started the museum planning process now, I mean, gosh, it's 7-8 years ago, we really wanted to keep that in the front of our minds, that this was not just a place to display stuff, but that it was a space for people to engage with the stuff and, more importantly, with each other and with the museum community. So we wanted to make sure there were congenial, classroom spaces and exhibit spaces and public spaces. But more recently, as anyone who's paid attention to the news in the last few years, this idea of all has become really much more inclusive, and that museums, like other public institutions and private ones, have been asked to really reflect on what that means to be inclusive, inclusive in its design, so that people with different abilities can access, and it's not just physical handicaps, it could be language differences. We have Chinese is the number 1 language spoken by many of our visitors. Italian is the second most common, so go figure. But 40% of our visitors are international visitors, so making the museum more accessible to that community. But the city of Cambridge has made pointed statements to the Institute that in this grand development in Kendall Square, that it's really important to not forget that right adjacent to this neighborhood are some of the poorest communities in Cambridge. And so, for example, one of the things we announced at the groundbreaking was that the museum would be free to Cambridge residents. We but that's the simple thing. Just because you make something free doesn't mean people will come to it. So we are working very hard to think about changing the ways in which we present ourselves, the gestures we make to make the place more accessible, to really live up to that informal statement of being accessible to all.
That's great. Thank you for sharing that. I'm sure everyone's now even more excited to see the new MIT Museum, and it's great that you're, constantly engaging and thinking about accessibility to all types of people. I see we have a couple of questions. So first one, let's see. I think it's from Masao. I'm sorry if I mispronounced your name. Would you like to come off mute?
Well, I can, well, let's see.
Yes. Do you have any plan of changing your museum
Yes.
shop? I love toys.
Well, the answer is it will be bigger, and we will also be introducing an online store presence as well. And I can tell you the provost has great hopes that that shop is very successful, so that it reduces the amount of the museum's annual request of the Institute in its budget. But yes, it will contain, I think, the same wonderful mix, only more of it in terms of science and technology themed gifts. The other really cool thing is that also in the ground floor of this building will be the MIT Press bookstore. So if you are a book hound, this is like your dream spot. And by the way, our address is 314 Main, and it is not lost on us that 314, of course, are the first three numbers in pi. So we're going to have a lot of fun with that as well. Charlie, you've asked about AIAA having a presence in the museum. And the answer is, I think at opening, there will be, for example, in essential MIT displays of LIGO and Sarah Sager's exoplanet work. In the AI, there will be displays about the work of the autonomous aerial autonomous vehicles, drones developed by Boeing / Aurora. I will be featuring Apollo guidance computer and the original simulators, as well as a large number of original models. We are looking to develop some specific Apollo programming, and perhaps at a later date, I might appeal to the local AIAA community to help think about how what might make some of those aerospace themed programs particularly attractive and compelling to this, to future visitors. But I also hope is not too long after opening that I can invite you all in for a tour. So instead of you listening to a talking head on the screen, that I can bring you in and walk you all around and take you into our workshop and bring out a lot of aerospace objects so that you can, get your nose as close as you'd like to them. Somebody asked about parking, and in comparison to what we have now, it'll be awesome. Right now, we have nothing but on-street parking. There are a number of lots, including in the underground area right next to this museum. There will be a public lot, so one will be able to park in quite close proximity to the museum. There are other lots nearby, but we will also be literally right on the MBTA's Kendall Square T-stop. So that will, I think, make the place more accessible for people who take public transportation, for example. Charlie, you've asked about can we be part of the opening? I'll bring it up to our engagement team, and maybe there's a way for that to, get incorporated into the opening events.
Great. I think the audience is all questioned out. Now, Dr. Douglas, you said something about the whirlwind flight simulation. I don't know if you're able to share that after the presentation with attendees. I'm sure people would definitely be interested in taking a look at what you have to share. But without,
I'm happy. I'm just a little aware of the time, so I don't want to. I want to be
yes,
respectful.
I meant yes. Kind of after the
Yeah.
event, if there's a way. I don't know if you have a heroes email or you'd like to send over something digitally.
Yeah, or I'll tell you in probably this summer, we're going to need to do some tests with people to prototype. We're working with some of the prototypes, and if there are people interested in that, they can simply email me. That I'll put that in the chat here. Yeah. Is because I'd be happy to invite you to take part in some of the beta testing of some of these, ideas. Or if you want to know what it's like to program a computer when they didn't know how to write a program and it's written in octal, just to, that's an ancient language that most people don't have to encounter. You still use it. It's just buried under layers of other programming language on top. But send me an email for anyone who wants to, is interested in that. Or if you're interested being in on the museum has a electronic mailing list that every couple of months sends out updates on what's going on. I will say though, we are probably the only museum on the planet that planned to be closed this year, which is, so because the process of moving is so complicated. We have 1.5 million objects to relocate either from our current site to this one or to a new offsite facility. We have all the exhibits to finish designing. There are videos to be made, labels to be written, mounts to be fabricated. And we've been doing it all on Zoom. And I will say this, I don't know what it's like to design airplanes or other systems online, but I don't really recommend a pandemic as being the optimal time to design a new museum. So there will be some features of things that maybe we would have done differently had we been able to meet in person or had different access. But on the other hand, it's an opening, and we've had 50 great years in this current site, and I hope we have another 50 great years in this one. And so, there'll be lots of new exhibits to come.
Great. Yeah, wishing you and your team all the best in, the final stretch.
Yeah.
And thank you again for your time. It's
great.
been a
Well,
really
thank
fascinating
you.
talk.
Thank you very much to everyone for the invitation, and have a great evening. And I hope you're all well and healthy, and as are your families. So good luck in the coming months. And perhaps I'll see you in some AIAA meeting, other meeting coming up.
Definitely. All right. Okay. Thank you, everyone.